New York was already fractured by desperation. Money moved in the dark. Power changed hands quietly. And Harlem sat inside a system it didn't control, governed by people who never intended to let it decide its own terms. That night wasn't supposed to matter. There was no ambush, no blood on the pavement, no police reports that would later be pulled from a file. What happened was smaller and far more dangerous. A moment designed to put someone in their place, witnessed by the right people at the wrong time. The man being positioned was Bumpy Johnson. The man doing the positioning was Dutch Schultz. In worlds like this, disrespect isn't accidental. It's calculated. It's a message delivered without words, meant to establish hierarchy and remind everyone watching who writes the rules. Schultz didn't need violence. He needed memory. He needed the moment to stick. Bumpy understood that immediately, and that's why he didn't react. Silence that night wasn't restraint. It was assessment. Reacting would have turned the moment into justification. Accepting it would have turned it into submission. So Bumpy chose the only option left, to remember it intact, without distortion. What most people miss about rivalries like this is where they actually begin. Not with gunfire, not with territory, but with the realization that coexistence is no longer possible, that one side has made it clear there will never be mutual respect, only tolerance until it's withdrawn. That realization didn't happen in public. It happened after midnight. By the time the night ended, nothing looked different on the surface, but something irreversible had already occurred. A line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. From that moment forward, every move Bumpy Johnson would make carried the same conclusion. This wasn't a dispute that could be managed. It was a conflict that would have to end. Before 1933, Harlem didn't belong to Bumpy Johnson, and it didn't belong to itself either. It existed inside a structure designed elsewhere, enforced by people who saw the neighborhood less as a community and more as a revenue surface. Control didn't come from presence on the street. It came from access to alcohol routes, numbers operations, and the permission to operate at all. That permission flowed through Dutch Schultz. Schultz didn't need to patrol Harlem. He didn't need to micromanage it. His power came from deciding who could profit without being crushed. Harlem operators weren't partners. They were tenants. And tenants don't set terms. They comply, adapt, and hope to remain useful. At this stage, Bumpy Johnson was not yet a symbol. He was a reader of systems. He watched how control actually worked, not through constant violence, but through selective pressure. Schultz allowed certain figures to rise just enough to manage daily operations, then reminded them, subtly, publicly, where the ceiling was. This arrangement created a specific tension. Harlem had activity, but no sovereignty. Deals happened, but dignity didn't. Ambition existed, but it had to be quiet. Anyone who forgot that was corrected quickly, not always with force, but with exclusion. That's the environment Bumpy was navigating. What made it fragile was not brutality. It was humiliation. Power that humiliates doesn't stabilize. It provokes calculation. People begin asking how long the imbalance can last, not whether it's justified. And once that question enters the room, conflict becomes inevitable. Schultz believed the structure was permanent. Harlem would always need access, always need protection, always need permission. From his perspective, reminders of hierarchy weren't risky. They were maintenance. Bumpy saw something else. He saw that Harlem's problem wasn't lack of muscle. It was lack of recognized standing. As long as its representatives were treated as disposable, cooperation would never become loyalty. And without loyalty, the system could only function under constant pressure. That's why the night in 1933 mattered. It didn't occur in a vacuum. It landed on top of years of accumulated imbalance. Harlem wasn't calm. It was contained. And containment works only until the people being contained decide that memory is more dangerous than retaliation. Before that night, coexistence was tense but possible. After it, the math changed. Because once humiliation replaces negotiation, the conflict stops being about territory. It becomes about whether coexistence itself is still an option. The moment itself was brief. That's what made it effective. There was no shouting, no threat spelled out, no violence to point to later. What happened was placement. A calculated move meant to establish who stood above whom, in front of the people whose opinions mattered. Dutch Schultz understood that hierarchy, once displayed publicly, doesn't need repetition. One clean demonstration is enough. The target was Bumpy Johnson. Schultz didn't need to insult him directly. He needed to frame him, to show that any access Bumpy had existed at Schultz's discretion. The message wasn't personal. It was structural. It told everyone watching where Harlem's ceiling was and who controlled it. That's why the setting mattered. The presence of witnesses turned the act into policy. A private slight can be dismissed. A public one becomes precedent. Schultz wasn't provoking a fight. He was closing a door. He was signaling that Harlem's representatives would never be equals, only useful intermediaries. Bumpy understood the trap immediately. A sharp response would have confirmed Schultz's authority to discipline him. Silence would have looked like acceptance. Either way, reacting in the moment would have finalized the hierarchy Schultz was trying to lock in, so Bumpy did neither. He let the moment pass without acknowledgement. No visible reaction, no attempt to reclaim status. To outsiders, it looked like restraint. To Schultz, it likely looked like compliance. But to Bumpy, it was something else entirely. Evidence. Evidence that coexistence depended on submission. Evidence that respect would never be granted, only rationed. Evidence that any future negotiation would always begin from a position of inferiority. That's the danger of deliberate disrespect. It clarifies intent. Schultz believed he had reinforced control. What he had actually done was remove ambiguity. He turned a flexible arrangement into a fixed hierarchy, and fixed hierarchies create fixed enemies. Once the terms are made explicit, there's nothing left to negotiate. The night ended without incident. People dispersed. Business continued. On the surface, nothing had changed. But beneath that calm, the damage was already done. A boundary had been crossed that couldn't be relabeled as misunderstanding. Bumpy didn't leave that night planning revenge. He left with certainty. Certainty that the relationship had reached its limit. Certainty that time, not reaction, would decide what came next. And certainty that the next move, whenever it came, would not be about restoring balance. It would be about ending a structure that no longer allowed balance to exist. That's how a war begins without a single shot fired. In moments engineered for dominance, reaction is the currency. Dutch Schultz expected it. A flare of anger would justify discipline. A public objection would invite correction. Even a measured protest would have confirmed that the hierarchy had landed where Schultz intended. Any response would have completed the demonstration. So Bumpy Johnson gave him none. That wasn't restraint in the moral sense. It was calculation. Bumpy understood that the moment wasn't about feelings. It was about precedent. Schultz wasn't testing temperament. He was locking in a rule set. If Bumpy reacted, the rule would be sealed under the guise of order restored. Silence, by contrast, kept the rule unfinished. There's a reason seasoned operators don't react on cue. Reaction collapses time. It forces a decision before the field is measured. Schultz had advantages that night. Access, witnesses, leverage. Bumpy had one advantage Schultz couldn't control: delay. Delay keeps options alive. Delay turns a public slight into a private inventory. And inventory is where power is built. By not reacting, Bumpy avoided 3 traps at once. First, he denied Schultz the moral cover of handling a disruption. Second, he avoided teaching observers how to punish him. Third, he preserved ambiguity about intent, about timing, about whether the moment even mattered. Ambiguity is poison to fixed hierarchies because it prevents closure. What looks like weakness in the room can become strength the next morning. That night, Bumpy cataloged what he saw. Who laughed, who looked away, who went quiet. He noted how quickly the room accepted the framing, and how easily access was used as a leash. None of that required a response. It required memory. The kind that doesn't fade and doesn't exaggerate. Schultz misread that silence. He likely took it as compliance, maybe even relief. Powerful men often do. They assume the absence of protest means the absence of resolve. But silence can also mean the moment has been stored, not surrendered. This is the pivot that defines Bumpy's later method. He would rarely meet power where it expected him. He would let moments pass, then act where leverage had shifted and witnesses had thinned. The goal wasn't to answer disrespect. It was to outgrow the conditions that made disrespect possible. By the time the night ended, nothing visible had changed. Business continued. Faces smiled. But the internal decision had already been made. Coexistence, as structured, was finished. Not tonight. Not publicly. But definitively. Schultz thought the hierarchy was reinforced. Bumpy knew the clock had started. And once that clock starts, reaction is no longer the point. Outcome is. The real turning point didn't happen in the room. It happened after the witnesses dispersed, after the city absorbed the moment and moved on as if nothing had occurred. That quiet window is where conclusions harden, because there's no audience left to perform for, only consequences to weigh. For Bumpy Johnson, the calculation was brutally simple. As long as Dutch Schultz controlled access, Harlem would never negotiate as an equal. Any future deal would be conditional. Any success would be revocable. The night had proven that respect wasn't part of the structure. Permission was. And permission can always be withdrawn. That realization closed every exit. Bumpy didn't decide to retaliate. He decided something colder. There was no path back. No apology would change the hierarchy that had just been made public. No accommodation would restore standing. The only way forward was to make the existing structure unworkable over time. This is where patience becomes policy. Instead of planning a strike, Bumpy began planning a replacement, not of people, but of conditions. He understood that Schultz's power thrived on visibility and compliance. It needed rooms, witnesses, reminders. Take those away, and the structure would still exist, but it would lose its teeth. That wouldn't happen overnight. It would happen through erosion. After midnight, the questions changed. Not how do I answer this, but what must exist for this to never happen again? The answer wasn't violence. It was leverage. Relationships that didn't require permission. Networks that didn't depend on one gatekeeper. A Harlem that could function without asking. That's why nothing happened the next day, or the day after. Schultz saw no response and assumed success. That assumption bought Bumpy time, the most valuable currency in asymmetrical conflicts. While Schultz maintained control, Bumpy began learning where it bent. He mapped who benefited from the arrangement and who merely endured it. He watched how access was rationed and how quickly it could be choked. He noted which pressures produced obedience and which produced resentment. All of it fed a single objective: make coexistence impossible without confrontation. The decision after midnight wasn't emotional. It was structural. Bumpy accepted that the relationship was terminal and that the end would come not from a single act, but from a series of moves designed to shift the board beneath Schultz's feet. That meant choosing moments Schultz couldn't control, arenas where witnesses were fewer, and outcomes that looked like inevitability rather than defiance. From that point on, every delay served a purpose. Every silence added distance. Every measured step reduced the room Schultz needed to keep the hierarchy alive. The war hadn't started publicly, but it had started correctly. Because once the decision is made that a system cannot be reformed, the only question left is how patiently you can dismantle it without tipping your hand. After that night in 1933, nothing outwardly changed. And that was the point. The most dangerous rivalries don't announce themselves. They settle in. They turn routine into rehearsal and patience into pressure. From the outside, the relationship appeared intact. From the inside, it was already over. What made the break permanent wasn't retaliation. It was direction. Every move Bumpy made afterward followed the same logic. Avoid the arenas where the hierarchy was strongest, and invest in spaces where it couldn't reach. He didn't challenge authority head-on. He let authority overextend itself while building alternatives that didn't ask for permission. That kind of opposition doesn't provoke immediate response. It produces discomfort, then dependency, then loss of control. Schultz, for his part, continued operating as if the balance had been restored. That assumption mattered. It meant he expected compliance, not competition. And systems built on expectation are vulnerable to non-compliance that looks like routine. What turned a single night into a permanent enemy was the absence of reconciliation. No gestures followed. No efforts to smooth the moment over. Silence hardened into distance. Distance hardened into divergence. And divergence, once it reaches a certain point, can't be corrected without admitting weakness. Neither side did that. From that moment on, their interests no longer overlapped. They simply occupied adjacent territory under incompatible assumptions. One believed hierarchy had been reaffirmed. The other believed hierarchy had been exposed, and therefore doomed. That's the most dangerous split of all. Over time, the consequences compounded. Decisions that once required approval began to route around it. Relationships that once depended on access began to stand on their own. The structure that had enabled control started to look less like an asset and more like a constraint. None of this required confrontation. It required consistency. By the time open conflict eventually surfaced, the outcome had already been shaped by years of quiet divergence. The night in 1933 wasn't remembered because of what happened in the moment. It was remembered because it explained everything that followed. One night clarified a truth neither side could unlearn. Coexistence without respect is temporary. And once that truth is internalized, the path forward narrows until only one outcome remains. That's how a single night becomes a permanent enemy. Not through violence, but through the realization that there will never be a way back to before. 1933 wasn't remembered for a shooting, a raid, or a headline. It was remembered because it closed every alternative. After that night, nothing could return to how it had been, not because violence followed immediately, but because the logic of coexistence had collapsed. For Bumpy Johnson, the insult wasn't the injury. The injury was the clarity. It proved that Harlem would never be treated as an equal partner under the existing structure. Respect would always be conditional. Permission would always be temporary. And as long as that remained true, peace would only exist at someone else's discretion. For Dutch Schultz, the moment looked like control successfully maintained. That misreading mattered. It allowed time to pass without correction, and time is what turns divergence into destiny. While one side believed hierarchy had been reinforced, the other was already building beyond it. That's why the night couldn't be undone. No apology would have reversed the public framing. No concession would have erased the memory. Once a hierarchy is made visible and accepted by witnesses, it either hardens forever, or it produces an enemy who decides to dismantle it patiently. This story isn't about pride, it's about structure. About how a single act of deliberate disrespect can transform a manageable imbalance into an irreversible conflict. And about how the most enduring wars don't begin with rage. They begin with the understanding that there is no longer a shared future. 1933 marked that understanding. From that point forward, every move carried the same conclusion, even when it wasn't spoken aloud. Harlem could not live indefinitely under permission. And once that truth settled in, the end of coexistence wasn't a possibility. It was a timeline,